I would like to know, for example, when you lived in Baghdad to report for the New Yorker, the editors asked you actually to leave the country, and you decided to stay. And where exactly is the border line for you as an investigative journalist?
You know, they wanted me to leave because they didn't want me to be killed. And I had to make a judgment call about, I'd spent months preparing myself psychologically, emotionally, and materially to be there for the invasion. And I very much wanted to be amongst the Iraqis in Baghdad, in Saddam's Baghdad, as perverse as it sounds, because I had gotten to know it a little bit. And I felt that it was extremely important to be there. I had no interest in being embedded with the American troops, not that that couldn't have produced interesting results. I mean, some reporters did fine work and have produced wonderful books and so on as a result of that experience. But it wasn't what motivated me. I was fascinated by Baghdad, by Iraqi society under Saddam, and that was what I wanted to witness. I wasn't interested in war as such. I never have been, or in being with the American soldiers. And what interested me about Iraq was Baghdad, was this ancient city that was changing and had been reshaped again and again by brutal rule and war and invasion, and was about to be again. And I was in a state of thrall as a witness, as an eyewitness to the extraordinary tyranny of Saddam Hussein. The society he created a mute society full of good people, and amongst them were people that I knew who were his accomplices. And I was fascinated by the kind of, somehow the perverse perfection of his tyranny, that he had made the people he'd oppressed the handmaidens to their own sort of mass burial in life. They exalted him as he oppressed them. It was the most extraordinary situation. And yet I had no illusions about the fact that this war was being fought for the strangest and most specious of arguments. It didn't seem right. So I was torn about the war itself. Having witnessed Saddam's dictatorship, I desperately wanted to see him go, but I would have much preferred to see it all be ended with a single bullet. I never saw the reason for a war. All it would have required was a well-placed bullet in Saddam's head to end that. And it could have been done over many, many, many years. But be that as it may, I did remain in Baghdad. When the word came for me, when the request came for me to leave, it was the request of my boss, but it was of a fellow. He was a friend. He didn't want me to be hurt. And I had to make a judgment call along with a handful of other friends about whether I wanted to give up all of that, all of those months, all of that feeling, and the opportunity to witness with the risks that it entailed, and leave or stay. And I chose to stay, with trepidation, but I stayed.
You were born in the US, but you grew up in Taiwan, in Colombia, in South Korea as well, which I found particularly interesting because I'm originally from South Korea as well. Do you have any memories?
Yeah, well, I do. My earliest memories are, I was born in California, and at 2 we went to Seoul. And so this would have been not that many years after. This was at the end of the 50s. I was born in 57, so in 59, only 7 years after the end of Korean War. So the Korea I remember as a little boy, living on a mountainside overlooking Seoul, is really a vision of a past world. It's the Korea before the boom of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and before Hyundai and all of that. It was a world that was of mostly mud streets. I remember the vast river that snaked through the city. It was all low level, mostly wooden buildings, as I recall. I remember the old papasans in the street with bark raincoats made out of bark of I know they have a name. It was a kind of a traditional garb, I think that's now only can be seen in museums. I remember them very well. And I remember the smell of fermenting kimchi in wooden barrels on the street.
Do you still like it?
I hated it when I was a boy because you could smell it inside even the car,
Yeah.
but I love it now. And we had a maid who was more like a friend of the family, who was a Korean War widow, who was also an opera singer, but she had no work. And so every day at sunset, she would take me to the veranda overlooking Seoul outside of our house. And I also had a pet cricket that sang. We had singing crickets, and I had a singing cricket, and she would sing when the sun went down, some kind of Korean song. I remember these things. And my mother used to leave me with some monks in a temple just on the top of the hill, and they would look after me. They were sort of my babysitters. And they used to let me play with the pieces of the I Ching. Yeah. And I remember that. I have a lot of memories of Korea.
Oh,
I remember going to Panmunjom as well. It's my earliest notion of something that called war existed. And my father took me there. I didn't know that it was a place called Panmunjom, but what I remember, my distinct memory is of going to a place, it must have been autumn, everything was orange and burnt color. I don't remember the buildings that now you see in pictures now, the low-level whitewashed buildings. What I do remember is going up something like a low watchtower and standing next to a soldier in a gray uniform. And it was cold. And I was looking up at him, and he didn't look at me, which was unusual. Usually an adult would say hello to a child. He didn't. And he had a gun, and he looked across the brush, not that far. In my memory, it's 50 feet, 30 feet, to another soldier looking across this way. And the two looked at each other and didn't speak. And I asked my father, I said, why aren't they speaking? What's the problem? And he explained to me that the two countries had been at war and that this was the place where the two sides had stopped. And I had my first history lesson at the age of, I must have been 3. There, standing literally on the DMZ.